The dust had a way of settling differently on that property. Not the dry, restless kind that shifted with every passing wind and scattered at the slightest disturbance, but something heavier. It landed and stayed, as if it had made a quiet decision to remain. The wooden fence posts along the south boundary had leaned so far east, they looked like men frozen mid-bow, caught in some ceremony nobody remembered the purpose of anymore. The well cover had caved into itself, and the iron ring that once anchored the bucket chain had rusted to a shade almost indistinguishable from the soil beneath it. That deep, burnt orange particular to this stretch of territory, a colour that bled into everything it touched long enough. The house itself stood with the kind of stillness that only accumulates over years of genuine absence. Not the stillness of a place between uses, but the stillness of a place that had stopped expecting anyone. One shutter hung by a single hinge on the east-facing window. The porch boards had warped and split along their grain, some of them angling toward the ground, as though the building were slowly trying to genuflect. 3 cottonwood saplings had pushed up through the gap between the porch and the main structure, their roots already deep into the foundation's edge, working with the patient determination of things that have no reason to hurry. That was how the Price Ranch sat on the morning Nora Callahan arrived. She came from the northeast, which was not the direction people usually approached from, and she came alone, which was the detail that would be discussed in the settlement for weeks afterward. A woman, alone, in a wagon loaded to a practical but not excessive degree, driving a grey mare and a brown gelding that both looked road-worn but not damaged. She wore a dust coat the colour of old canvas and a hat with a brim wide enough to keep her face in shadow, and she pulled the wagon to a stop 20 feet from the front gate, what remained of the front gate, which was 1 post still standing and 1 post horizontal in the weeds. And she sat there for a long moment, just looking at the property. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look overwhelmed. She looked like a woman doing arithmetic in her head. The first person to see her arrive was a boy named Rudy, the 14-year-old son of Celia Montoya, who ran the dry goods store at the edge of the settlement 2 miles east. Rudy had been out checking his father's old irrigation line, which hadn't worked properly in 3 seasons and probably never would again, and he'd come up over the ridge at exactly the wrong moment to avoid seeing something unusual. He stood at the top of the rise with a wrench in his hand and watched the woman climb down from the wagon, pull off her hat, and study the ranch house with an expression he described later as, like she was reading a letter she'd already memorized. He didn't approach her. He walked back to his mother's store and told her what he'd seen, and by that afternoon the information had travelled the full circuit of the settlement without anyone needing to make a deliberate effort. The Price Ranch had someone on it. A woman. Alone. Nobody recognized her name. Nora Callahan was 34 years old, originally from further north. Some said she'd come from cattle country, some said she'd come from mining country, and a few people, the ones who would eventually be closest to the truth, said she looked like someone who had come from somewhere difficult and wasn't in a hurry to explain the specifics. She carried documentation for the property in a leather satchel tucked under the wagon seat, a deed of purchase signed through a land agency in a town 2 days' ride away, properly notarized, entirely legal. She had bought the Price Ranch at auction, the kind held when a property sits unclaimed long enough that the county declares it abandoned and opens it for bid. She had bid against nobody. The auctioneer had apparently looked surprised that anyone had shown up at all. The previous owner, Edmund Price, had walked off the property on a September morning 12 years prior and had not returned. He hadn't sold it, hadn't transferred the deed, hadn't communicated with anyone in the territory about his intentions. He had simply left. People in the settlement had different theories about why, and as with most things people theorize about extensively, the more time passed, the further the theories drifted from whatever had actually happened. Some said his wife's death had made the place unbearable. Some said he'd had financial trouble. Some said, and these were the people who lowered their voices when they said it, that there was something about the eastern section of the land, the stretch that ran up toward the rock formation the local Apache called Tseligai, the White Rock, that he had never been comfortable with and eventually could not remain near. What any of that meant precisely, none of them were willing to commit to directly. It was the kind of knowledge a community holds the way they hold a cup with a crack in it, carefully, without drawing attention to the crack, and always prepared for the moment it gives way. What Nora knew, or what she had been told at the time of purchase, was simpler. The land had sat empty for 12 years, the structure was still standing, and the price had been low enough that her modest accumulated savings had covered it with something left over. She was not a woman of sentiment. She was a woman who had spent 11 years working other people's land, as a hand, as a manager of a small operation that later failed through no fault of her own, and for almost 3 years as a cook and supply manager for a survey crew crossing land she found more interesting than any of the men on the crew seemed to. She understood land. She understood what it asked of you, and what it could give back if you met it at least part-way honestly. She spent the first 3 days alone on the property before anyone came to speak with her. The interior of the house was in better condition than the exterior suggested, which was the first genuine surprise. Edmund Price had apparently closed the windows properly before leaving. Every window latch was still engaged, and the interior walls had been protected from the worst of the weather as a result. The stove was usable. The main room's floor was warped in 2 places but not broken through. The back bedroom had a leak in the roof above the east corner, but it was a small leak, the kind that could be addressed in an afternoon with the right materials. There were still objects in the house. Not many, not furniture of significance, not anything that looked deliberately left, but small things. A tin cup on a shelf, a pair of leather work gloves hung on a nail beside the door, a calendar on the wall showing a month from 14 years ago, 2 years before Edmund Price had left, as though someone had stopped marking the passage of time and then eventually just stopped thinking about it. Nora did not move any of these things immediately. She noted them. She moved around them. She learned the house's existing logic before she imposed her own. If this story is holding you, a subscription to the channel means more narratives like this one keep coming. It takes almost nothing from you and makes all the difference on this end. The first person to actually approach her was a man named Hector Salinas. Hector Salinas was 41 years old, dark-haired, broad through the shoulders, with a way of carrying himself that communicated he was accustomed to being the largest presence in a given situation without needing to make a point of it. He ran a cattle operation on the property directly to the west of the Price land. His family had run cattle in this valley for 2 generations, and in the 12 years since Edmund Price had abandoned his ranch, Hector had quietly allowed his herd to graze the eastern portions of the adjacent property. Not officially, not through any legal arrangement, just as a practical matter of unclaimed land sitting adjacent to land that needed more grazing capacity. He had done this without anyone objecting, because there was nobody to object. The arrangement had settled into the valley's routines, the way most unofficial arrangements do. Not through permission, but through the simple accumulation of time. He rode up to the property on a Thursday morning and found Nora on the porch, pulling warped boards and stacking them to the side. She heard him coming and didn't stop working. She glanced up when he was close enough for a normal conversation, said good morning, and went back to the board she was working loose. Hector had planned, in a vague way, to assess what kind of person he was dealing with before deciding on his approach. The way she didn't stop working reset that plan somewhat. "You bought the Price land," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did," she said. "Alone?" She pulled the board free, walked it to the stack, set it down. "Looks that way." He sat on his horse and watched her work for a moment. "That eastern section runs up near the rock formation. That land's been used for grazing." "Whose cattle?" He paused, just a fraction of a second too long. Mine. Then I'll need you to move them off before the end of the month, she said. I'll be running my own stock out there by then. The conversation that followed was not a fight exactly. Hector was not a man who began confrontations directly, especially not with a person he'd just met and had not yet fully understood. But it was not a friendly exchange either. He communicated in measured terms that he had been the effective steward of that land for over a decade, that he had a working knowledge of its specific difficulties, and that a woman arriving alone with a deed from a land auction did not change the practical realities of the valley's operations. He said these things evenly, without hostility, in the way a man says things when he's decided that his position is so reasonable it doesn't require raising his voice. He mentioned, once and only once, that the eastern section near Tseligai had a history people around here respect. He let that sit without elaborating. Nora listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "I appreciate the information. I'll need the cattle off the land by the end of the month." He left without further argument, which told her something about him. A man who argues past his point has already stopped thinking. A man who stops before that is either respectful or strategic. She filed both possibilities without committing to either. The end of the month came, and Hector's cattle were off the eastern section. She hadn't needed to say anything further. She had her own animals by then, 15 head of cattle purchased from a seller 2 days east, 4 goats, the 2 horses that had pulled the wagon, and a dog of indeterminate heritage named Cobb, who had attached himself to her during her time with the survey crew years ago, and had not shown any interest in attaching himself to anyone else since. Cobb was large, unhurried, and possessed of a disposition so even that even Hector's horse, a famously difficult animal that everyone in the settlement called simply the roan, had stood still when the dog first approached him. Animals that, even tempered, either have no history or have made their peace with one. Nora had never determined which applied to Cobb, and he hadn't offered any indication. The work of rebuilding the ranch was not romantic. It was sequential, practical, and exhausting in the specific way that work is exhausting when there is nobody to divide it with. She repaired the roof in sections over the course of 2 weeks, working mornings before the heat peaked and again in the late afternoon when the light came back at an angle that let her see what needed correcting. She rebuilt the well cover, replaced the collapsed gate, treated the fence posts along the north and south lines with a tar solution she'd learned from an old fence builder she'd worked alongside years before. The process left her hands stained dark for 10 days. She didn't particularly mind. What she minded slightly was the quality of the silence. It was not the silence she'd expected from an empty property. She'd lived on empty properties before. She'd managed a stretch of land in the north for almost a year by herself, and that land had been quiet in a way that felt natural, like the breathing of something sleeping. This property's silence had a different texture, not threatening, not superstitious. She was not a person given to superstition, but present in a way that empty silences usually weren't. She noticed it most in the eastern section, near the rock formation, in the hour before sunset, when the shadows from Tseligai stretched long across the grass. She would be working, and then notice that she'd stopped without meaning to, looking east at the rocks. She mentioned this to no one for the first several weeks. The person who eventually offered her some understanding of it was not from the settlement. Her name was Tani, and she appeared one morning at the western fence line without warning, an Apache woman somewhere between 40 and 50, wearing practical work clothes and carrying a basket that held dried plants wrapped in cloth. She stood at the fence and waited, which Nora noticed immediately. It was the waiting that caught her attention, the deliberate patience of someone who expected to be seen and was giving time for that to happen. There was a considerateness to it that was easy to read once you understood what you were looking at. Nora walked over. They looked at each other for a moment across the fence line. "You're working the Price land," Tani said. "It's my land now," Nora said. Not hostile, just clear. Tani considered this without visible reaction. "The rock formation on your eastern edge," she said. "Tseligai. There are people buried in the ground near its base. Not recently. Old." She paused. "The man who was here before, he knew this. He asked about it." "What did he ask?" "He asked whose they were. We told him. He started digging out there, looking for something he thought was there." She didn't elaborate on what, specifically, Edmund Price had believed he was looking for. It was possible Tani didn't know. It was also possible she'd decided that particular detail wasn't hers to give. He stopped eventually, but after that he never worked that section comfortably again. Nora stood with this information for a moment. The morning was cool, and the light was coming in low over the eastern ridge, catching the pale face of Tseligai and making it look almost white, which was perhaps where the name had come from. Was he wrong to dig? He was wrong about what he thought he'd find, Tani said. It was not a complete answer. Nora understood it wasn't meant to be. She thanked Tani, and Tani walked away, and Nora stood at the fence for a while, looking east toward the rock formation, with the same expression Rudy Montoya had once described as someone reading a letter they'd already memorized. She didn't dig out there. She had no interest in digging. What she had was a practical need to graze cattle on that section, and she did so, and the cattle seemed entirely indifferent to whatever history the ground contained. She let that be the operating reality. The eastern section fed her herd through the dry months better than any other part of the property. The grass there grew differently, thicker at the root, slower to go brown in the heat. Whether that had anything to do with what lay beneath it, or whether it was simply a matter of groundwater and soil composition, she couldn't say and didn't particularly need to. Good grass was good grass. The settlement's relationship with her shifted over the following months in the way these things always shift, not through any single event, but through accumulation. She bought consistently from Celia Montoya's dry goods store and paid on time, which was not as universal in that territory as it should have been. She fixed a section of road near the property boundary that had been washing out with every significant rainfall, not because anyone asked her to, but because it made her access better, and also, as it happened, made things easier for Celia's delivery wagon. She attended a communal gathering related to a property boundary dispute that had nothing to do with her, and offered a perspective that 3 people later told her had been the clearest framing of the issue anyone had provided. She was not trying to be liked. She was being legible. There is a difference, and most people understand it instinctively, even when they can't put a name to it. Rudy Montoya began appearing at the ranch on Saturday mornings. Not to work, initially, just to be nearby. He brought his lunch and sat on the repaired fence and watched whatever was happening. Nora neither invited him closer nor sent him away, which he eventually interpreted correctly as permission to make himself useful. He could split wood well. He could not yet manage a fence repair without supervision, but he was learning the logic of it. He talked more than she typically preferred, but the things he said were usually interesting in proportion to his age, and she found she had developed a tolerance for his presence that surprised her somewhat. It was Rudy who told her about the letters. He told her in early winter, on a morning when the ground had frosted overnight, and the light had that particular thin quality of cold-season mornings, the kind of light that seems to arrive reluctantly. He'd been helping her carry timber for a new storage shed, and he said, with the abruptness of someone who has been working up to saying something for some time, "There are letters in the floor of the back room, under the board that's loose by the east wall." She stopped walking. "How do you know that?" "Everybody knows," he said. "Kids used to dare each other to come out here and look through the windows. 2 of them got in once, years ago. They found the loose board. They didn't take the letters because they were afraid." "Afraid of what?" He shrugged, which was the most honest answer available to him. She found the board that evening. Third board from the east wall in the back room, not particularly hidden, just loose the way boards in old houses sometimes are, set down slightly off its beam so that one edge was raised half an inch. Beneath it, in the gap between the floorboards and the ground, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had done its job adequately for over a decade, were 11 letters. She brought the lamp over and sat down on the floor with them. They were letters Edmund Price had written to his wife Iris. Or rather, they were letters he had written after Iris had died, not sent anywhere, written in the way people sometimes write when they need to say something to someone who is no longer available to hear it. The dates began 2 weeks after Iris's death, which had been approximately 13 years ago. They ended 14 months later, which placed the final letter several months before Edmund had left the property for the last time. The letters were private in a way that made reading them feel uncomfortable, even to a woman not given to sentiment, but Nora read them because the property was hers and the letters were on the property, and she believed, as a working principle, that you should understand the ground you stood on as fully as possible. Edmund Price had been a man who communicated more clearly to his dead wife in letters she could never read than he probably had when she was alive. The letters talked about the land, the seasons, the specific difficulty of doing work alone when you had built that work around having a partner in it. They talked about the eastern section and about the day Edmund had met a man from Tani's family and asked about the burial ground, and about how the man had told him there was nothing he could dig up that would fix what was wrong with him, and how Edmund had understood immediately that this was true and dug anyway and found nothing but earth. The letters talked about Iris's own history. She had been half Apache, born to a mother from Tani's extended family and a father who'd come out as a surveyor and decided to stay. Edmund had spent years only partially accounting for what that connection meant, what it meant that the land he'd built his ranch on sat at the edge of ground that had held her family's dead for generations, that the woman he'd built his life with had roots here that ran deeper than any fence he'd ever posted. After her death he had stood in that eastern section on an evening in late autumn, looking at Seligai going dark as the sun dropped, and he had understood, with the sudden clarity that sometimes arrives too late to do anything useful with, that he'd treated the land's connection to Iris as secondary to his own relationship with both of them, and that standing on it without her had become something he could not do and could not explain. The last letter was short. He had apparently lost the inclination for length by then. It said, "I think the land will forgive me for leaving it. I think you would have stayed." Nora sat with the letters in her hands for a long time. The frost had moved off the ground by midday, but the evening had brought the cold back, and the lamp she'd set beside her was the only source of warmth in the back room. Cobb had come in at some point and laid down against her leg, which he did occasionally without apparent reason, and which she had stopped trying to interpret. She did not feel exactly that she had been given a gift. What she felt was something more like responsibility, which was both heavier and more familiar to her than gifts had ever been. She put the letters back in the oilcloth. She put the oilcloth back in the space beneath the board. She set the board back in its place, one edge still raised half an inch, and she did not nail it down. The winter passed in the way winters pass when you are working hard, and have good reason to, not quickly, but purposefully, which amounts to something similar. The storage shed was completed before the worst of the cold arrived. The cattle came through in reasonable shape. Cobb developed a reliable habit of sleeping in front of the stove that made the kitchen feel less empty in the evenings, and Nora had stopped thinking of the habit as a thing she'd noticed and started thinking of it as a thing she expected, which is a small shift but not an insignificant one. Rudy continued to appear on Saturday mornings, and in his quietly accumulating competence with the ranch's various physical demands, he had become, without either of them making a formal arrangement of it, something close to a regular hand. Hector Salinas came by twice during the winter, both times ostensibly on practical matters, once about a fence line, once about water access from the shared creek. Both times Nora met him at the gate, and the conversations resolved fairly quickly. He was not a bad man. She had not concluded that he was, even from the beginning. He was a man who had operated in a certain way for a long time, and was recalibrating to a changed situation, and recalibration takes time. She wasn't making it hard either. She was keeping the arrangement clear, which is all recalibration really requires from the other party. In March, Tani came to the fence line again. This time she had 2 other women with her, both younger, both carrying themselves with the same practical work demeanor that seemed to be a common quality in Tani's company. They were bringing something, which turned out to be seed, varieties specific to this altitude and this soil composition, plants that Tani had grown in proximity to this valley for decades. She set the wrapped parcels on the fence post and said, "For the south plot, that ground will carry these." Nora looked at the seeds. "I don't have much experience with this type of cultivation." "You'll learn," Tani said. Not unkindly. The way you say something when it's a fact rather than an opinion. She did learn. It took the better part of that growing season to develop anything approaching competence with what Tani's seeds asked of the soil, and the first yield was modest and uneven in places. But the plants that grew in the south plot that year grew with a vitality that none of the other ground on the property had yet produced. Something in the combination of those seeds and that particular section of ground was working in a way that outpaced what she could explain from her own knowledge of cultivation, and she was sensible enough to stop trying to explain it and simply maintain the conditions that seemed to be producing the result. By late summer, the south plot looked genuinely alive, in a way the rest of the property was still working toward. The color of it was different, a deeper green, almost blue in the long evening light, and the yield from even that modest first planting gave her more than she'd budgeted for, which allowed her to put resources toward the paddock expansion she'd been postponing. People from the settlement started finding reasons to come by. Not in groups, and not always announcing themselves, often just pausing at the road and looking across at the property. Celia Montoya came one afternoon under the pretext of a delivery, and ended up staying for 2 hours, drinking coffee on the repaired porch and looking at the view. The rock formation to the east caught the afternoon light in a way that changed it from merely large to something more considered. The grass between the house and the base of the rocks had come in green, and even that season, and with Cobb moving through it at his characteristic unhurried pace, the whole composition had a quality that was hard to name and easy to look at. "The Price Ranch," Celia said at one point, almost to herself, with the tone of someone recalling something that had been present for so long, it had become the name of the thing rather than the name of a person. "Callahan Ranch," Nora said. Celia looked at her. She held the coffee cup with both hands and let the corrections settle into her understanding the way warm liquid settles into cold ground, slowly, evenly, finding all the spaces. Then she nodded, with the careful weight of someone acknowledging something that has already been decided and simply needed saying out loud. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no particular ceremony to it. The sun was coming down over the western ridge, bending the shadows of the fence posts out long across the yard, and the horses in the paddock were eating quietly with the unhurried concentration horses bring to eating. Somewhere in the direction of the rock formation, a bird Nora had not yet learned to identify was repeating the same 5-note phrase with patient consistency, as if trying to teach it to someone who hadn't arrived yet. Cobb walked out of the south plot's long grass and came up onto the porch and settled at her feet and didn't move again. That, as far as anyone who was there could account for it, was when the ranch became what she'd come to make it. Several months later, in November, a letter came through the settlement addressed to the property, but with no specific name on it, just the legal land description, handwritten in an ink that had bled slightly into the paper, as though the writer had sat with the envelope a long time before deciding to send it. Inside was a single page from Edmund Price, written in a hand that had gotten slightly shakier than the handwriting in the letters under the floor, but was still recognizable as the same person. He didn't explain where he was, or how he'd come to hear what he'd apparently come to hear. He said only that news had reached him through several degrees of distance that someone had bought the land and was working it properly, and that the south plot was in use again, which he said Iris would have appreciated, because Iris had always believed that ground had a better use than cattle pasture, and had never convinced him of it while she was alive to argue the point. He said he was glad. He asked without expectation, without any suggestion that it would change anything either way, that if there were letters remaining under the board in the back room of the house, they be left where they were. Nora wrote back to the address on the envelope. She said the land was in good shape. She said the south plot was producing better than she'd expected for a first season. She said the letters were where he'd put them, and that they would stay there. She did not ask him to come back because it was not her place to ask that, and because she didn't think it was what he needed to hear. What she said instead, in the last 2 lines of the letter, was that the property was cared for, and that a person who had loved it and left it could rest on that fact as much or as little as they needed to. She didn't hear back. She hadn't entirely expected to. The board in the back room stayed loose, set down slightly off its beam. One edge raised 1/2 inch. She had thought once or twice about nailing it down. She had held the nail against the wood and the hammer in her hand, and considered it with the same practical arithmetic she brought to most decisions. Both times she had set the hammer back down and moved on to something else. Some things that are in place don't need to be secured. They stay because they've found the right position, and securing them only makes it harder to reach them when someone eventually needs to. Tell us in the comments, would you have read the letters?